Immigration is not just a story about immigrants, but also the children they raise, the cities they move to, and the knowledge and skills that get carried across borders. My guest today is Leah Boustan, professor at Yale and co-author of Streets of Gold, one of the best and most important books ever written on immigration and intergenerational mobility. Here's our talk. Hello, welcome to the Economics of Work. I'm excited to welcome Leah Boustan, professor at Yale and author of one of my favorite economics books of all time, Streets of Gold, co-authored with Ron Abraminski. Leah, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to talk about mobility, because I think of what you did as like directly about immigration, but like also kind of about mobility, right? Is that like the way to think about it?
Yeah, I think it's partially about social mobility as well, and the role of moving between places as immigrants or internal migrants in generating social mobility.
Let's say we had an intergenerational mobility coefficient for the world. So just like, I don't know if anyone's really done this. Maybe they have. But if you had some like mobility index, how much of that do you think can be explained approximately? Like how much of that do you think is explained by people moving between countries rather than mobility within countries?
Well, moving between countries is just an enormous part. And I think people often forget about that when they are trying to understand immigrants in their own country. So, as Americans, we're looking around and imagining, are immigrants at the bottom of the distribution? Are they moving towards the middle? What's going on with their kids? But we forget the piece that starts before immigrants arrive here, as they're moving from their home country to the US. And historically, many of our immigrants came from Europe. And I'm talking about, 100 years ago, Ellis Island period. And at that time, the GDP per capita ratio between our sending countries and the US as a destination was around 2-to-1 in favor of the US, so you could maybe double your income on average by moving to the US. But now, if we're thinking about our typical sending countries, you're thinking about immigration today, the ratio is more like 6-to-1, depending on which country we're talking about. And so there's the potential for, tripling, quadrupling income when moving from the home country to the US. And that piece is just enormous in terms of upward mobility.
What do you think explains that transition of, sending countries being on average poor? I mean, is that just like the rich countries just like growing faster than the poor countries, or like globalization at large? Like what do you think is the mechanism that explains that?
Well, some of it is the democratization of immigration, so if you go back 100 years, there were some very poor places that were just so poor that they couldn't even raise enough capital to buy a ticket on a boat to get to the US. And if they arrived in the US, that they would not have had any kind of network from the home country to be able to plug into and find a job and get started. And so you have to reach a certain level of development before you can even contemplate the idea of moving somewhere else. So that's a piece of it. But I also think, Ben, you're absolutely right that the gaps between rich and poor have grown in the past century as the richer countries have gotten richer. And then in just the past 10, 20 years, there has been some convergence with the poorer countries catching up. But when we're thinking about immigration today, that process really began in earnest in the 70s. And the 70s and the 80s was a period where there was just very large gaps between rich countries and poor countries.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm thinking of this like $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk, Michael Clemens framework, where that is like a huge path to wealth creation globally. If the difference between sending countries and destination countries is so large, then that sounds very exciting. This sounds like, we can like have more global economic growth at large. Is that a big part of global economic growth, or does most growth in like GDP per capita in the world still happen within countries?
Well, around 2% of the world's population are immigrants. And so even if the immigrants themselves have a large gain, I just don't think that the flow of immigration is large enough that it would contribute meaningfully to global growth. I mean, I haven't done the decomposition, but if it's only 2% of the world's population. Now, if you go back 100 years and you think about some of our sending countries from Europe, take Norway, for example, like a very poor and pretty small country in 1900, around a third of the Norwegian population left and moved to, the US or to some extent Canada. And so that's enough of a outflow that it can have a very substantial effect on, if you just were to aggregate everyone who was born in Norway and you thought about that as a population where you were thinking, well, what's their standard of living or what's their GDP per capita? An outflow of a third is enough to really turn the dial, but that's not really going on these days. And there's substantial immigration barriers. I mean, we don't have the kind of open border that we used to have.
Yeah, I mean, in this Norway example, I mean, I loved your analysis on Norway because there were so many interesting counterintuitive things that you found from there. One was that the stayers did better than the leavers, which I thought was such a wild result. What do you think is the mechanism for that?
Well, just to clarify on that point, so I think you're thinking about the returners. So
Oh,
they're
I was thinking about the brothers.
the
Wasn't
brothers.
that
Okay.
something? Yeah.
Okay, well, the migrants do better than the brothers who stay, but the migrants are doing better almost entirely, or let's say entirely, because the US was a richer place. So the
Mhm.
brothers who leave are not moving up the occupational ladder relative to the brothers who stay. It's just that holding the same occupation but being in a very productive location means that you have higher earnings in the end. So the brothers who leave do earn around double what the brothers who stay earn. It's just in occupational terms, they're sort of doing the same thing, but doing the same thing in a poor country and doing the same thing in a rich country is going to lead to very different outcomes. But then there's a group of
Yeah.
Norwegians who come to the US for a short period of time, 3 to 5 years, and then they save up in the US and they return home, and they're doing better than the Norwegians who never left. So there's something really valuable about coming to the US, saving up, and having enough capital to come back to Norway and start a business or buy some land for yourself.
Interesting. What do you attribute that to? Is it like just an influx of savings from higher income, or is it some bringing back culture? Like, what do you think drives that?
Some of it is bringing back technology and production techniques, I think. I don't know for sure. I haven't really dived into this in the data for Norway, but there's farming techniques and mechanization that's going on in US farming that was at the technological frontier in agriculture that people could bring back to Norway. And we see a lot of the same process going on for immigrants today. So just like one interesting example from my time living in central New Jersey is there's a large Guatemalan migration to central Jersey. And then when living in the US, people learned about wood-fired pizza ovens, which was something that just didn't exist in Guatemala. And then they imported the first wood-fired pizza ovens to Guatemala and became like, a very successful restaurateur, sort of retail chain restaurant kind of within the country because they were bringing a technology and a cultural concept, I guess, in terms of a style of food that didn't exist back home.
Yeah, interesting. I've always sort of lumped together cultural assimilation with technological spillover, but you're right that those are like really distinct concepts. Do you think that if we think about like what happens to a migrant, what do they pick up on? How do they change as a result of living in a new place? I wonder how much of that is like really, about like the melting pot where the destination becomes kind of an aggregation of all these different people, or if there's just like something about the destination country that gets passed on. Like, is the destination country kind of like, has its own technology and culture because of some institutional factors, or is it really more of that melting pot? Like, how do you think about like what it is about the destination country's facets of technology and culture? Yeah, how should we make sense of that?
Wow, well, that's really hard to pick apart.
Yeah.
I suppose, like, you could imagine within the US that there's going to be some regional differences in culture or in technological advancement that would help you try to isolate that. But those things are so interconnected. The institutional framework might make it possible to invest in the most frontier technology. And then the ideas that are coming from around the world, so the specific craft traditions, for example, that are coming from Germany or from Scotland to the US in the mid 19th century, then might allow for ideas that moves the technology forward. So the melting pot, the culture, the institutions, and the technology are pretty hard to separate from each other, I would say.
Yeah, I would think so too. How do you think about the role of companies in this kind of assimilation process? If we had an economy that were just like a bunch of independent tradespeople, I would imagine assimilation would look very different than if we had an economy full of like big, gigantic companies.
I have a lot of thoughts about this, actually. I mean, and I think that this is getting to some of the research frontier. So, in order to answer questions like that, you do need to have some matched employer employee data. You need to be able to see, like, for workers who are just coming in as immigrants, what kinds of firms are they working at, and how does that change as they move through at the assimilation process? So in the US, I haven't seen someone be able to tackle that, but there's some work on that with admin data from Germany and admin data from Israel. And what people are finding is that actually the quality of the firm that you're employed at changes a lot as you go through the assimilation process and is a really meaningful contributor to what I would call economic assimilation, but you might want to think of it as earnings convergence between immigrants and native born workers. So when immigrants arrive, they start out with an earnings gap. And then they start to close that gap as they spend more time in the country. And I've always thought of that as a human capital story. Like, well, you don't know English when you arrive, and then 5 years later, you've learned English. And so you get some return to that learning that you've done.
Yeah.
And I've thought about it a little bit in terms of like job networks, but that was very nebulous in my mind. And now we can put something tangible there and say, well, actually, it's firms. When you first arrive, you end up working at a firm that we can see from the data has pretty low firm productivity. And then you make some job transitions. Maybe you move 2 or 3 times to different firms, and those firms are actually moving up the quality ladder. And, the way that economists try to pick out firm quality is to say, well, we can see workers working at different firms, and we can pull from that a sense of individual productivity. Like it might be that I'm just wildly productive no matter where I work, and that's going to be assigned to me as an individual. But then when you strip that part out, what remains is going to be firm productivity. And that's something that we can actually assign to a firm then and say, well, the data says that this is a firm that's high and this is a firm that's low on productivity. And it looks like immigrants, when they arrive, start out at these low productivity firms and then they move up the ladder. What might that actually be? It could be, well, they're working in retail at like a small bodega, like a little corner store. And that corner store is just not very productive. Like it's not generating a lot of revenue per worker hour. And then over time, they learn a bit more and they end up working instead at Target. And Target is just a much more high productivity firm. So that's what I mean, sort of like as an example. I mean, it's very abstract. If you're like high productivity firm, low productivity firm, what does that mean? And I think that example gives a sense of what's going on.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I mean, it kind of resonates intuitively. I think we kind of see patterns like that all the time. But why do you think immigrants start out at low productivity firms? Is it just that they don't have as much market power? Maybe the firms with less attractive, employment possibilities are the ones that are kind of forced into selecting employees with like low signal. I mean, yeah, why do they start out kind of, I would think about it as underemployed relative to their potential. Like, yeah, why are they kind of stuck in the beginning?
Well, that's a great question, and it goes beyond what I've seen people actually answer. But essentially, like there's attributes of low productivity firms, and which of the attributes are the ones that attract immigrant workers. And I would think one possibility is that it has to do with these occupational niches or ethnic job networks. It could be that there are immigrant-owned firms that are smaller. They're new and they haven't grown yet. Those are the firms that are willing to hire immigrant workers. So you might get the job through your ethnic network, and you might be entering into the firm at the beginning of its life cycle when it's smaller and not as productive. Or it could have something to do with location, so the types of firms that are in certain inner city neighborhoods, which are like maybe the landing place for a new immigrant arrival, are lower productivity. They don't have as much of a customer base. There's not as many people walking by. And then some of it is also on the manufacturing side. I mean, I'm thinking retail, but some of it's also on the manufacturing side. Initially, I'm thinking firm size, like
Yeah.
you're kind of in a small welding shop versus a larger, sort of more established manufacturing location. And you might need to build up a certain resume in the US before a more established, larger corporate firm is willing to take a chance on you. But these are great questions. I mean, this is something that both, quantitative economics research should be focusing on now that we've documented those facts, but also some qualitative work as well, I think.
For sure. I mean, I would think on the first one, like that kind of interacts with research on FDI. you have these foreign owned firms, and then, they're sort of presumably, take a lot of the productivity from the country where they come from. So I would think that could be disentangled. Firm size also, why not?
Yep.
You mentioned location. I mean, that's, you have like, such interesting research on the effect of location on earning potential for migrants. And, I think you've shown that when migrants move to a place, they move to high productivity, high growth cities. Is that still happening, or is that kind of lessening in a way? Like what is, and I would think that, in the world of remote work, that sort of means less. What do you make of the current role of geography in the mobility and upward potential for immigrants?
That is a great question. It allows me to plug some new research that I'm
Go for
doing
it. Yeah.
with Rana Bermitsky, as well as Elisa Jacome and Santiago Perez. So, as a foursome, we originally worked on the mechanisms behind the social mobility for children of immigrants historically. And the reason why we focused on the past for thinking about the mechanisms is just on the data side. After 72 years, the census data becomes publicly available, and we can see in the census data everything about the individual, all the identifying information. So we know exactly where people live, and we know all the background of their parents and so on. And when we did that, we found that, as you were just alluding to, geography is a really important part of how immigrants moved ahead historically. So immigrant families did not locate very much in the US South, which at the time was very agricultural, it was cotton growing, and it was not a location of high upward mobility.
Why didn't they move to the south? Was it because they didn't have the networks, or because it was low productivity, or what? Yeah, how do we explain
Our
that?
sense is because it was low productivity and it was not the kinds of industries that were relying on immigrant labor. So essentially, immigrants were like these heat seeking missiles to manufacturing centers, to the Chicago's and Detroit's and New York's and places that we now might think of as the Rust Belt, but at the time were really booming manufacturing centers. So in general, immigrants were moving more to cities than they were to rural or farm areas. And the South was very agricultural. And it was also the
Yeah.
kind of agriculture that you couldn't really just enter into as a small family farm. It was larger landowning and sharecropping. So you were working either as a renter or a share tenant. And that's not the kinds of opportunities that attracted immigrants at the time.
Yeah.
So we were not able to do this kind of deep dive into the mechanisms for the modern period. And so just for data reasons, so our data requirements were really intensive. We needed to have parent-child linkages so that we could see what the parents were doing and then how much the children were moving up relative to that. And it's very tough to get data with parent-child linkages today. That data tends to come from IRS, from the tax records. And then, of course, the privacy requirements are very high. But since we wrote Streets of Gold, there's now a research partnership at secure research data centers where modern data like this is shared with researchers, primarily those who are working with someone at the Census Bureau. And so we've been able to look at the mechanisms now for the modern period. And what we see is that geography plays a much smaller role for maybe some of the reasons that you were alluding to. But essentially what we're seeing is like there's two stories today. Neither of them are geography stories. So one story, not surprisingly, is that immigrant families are investing in education at a higher rate than similarly situated US born families. And that's true for immigrants from almost every background, except immigrants from Latin America. So immigrants from Latin America are investing in education at the same rate. Not less, but, just sort of keeping par with US born families who are similarly positioned in income terms. So
Hmm.
what's going on with the children of Latin American immigrants is that they are working more. They work more hours during the week and they have fewer spells of unemployment. So there are fewer weeks during the year where they're not working. And then you aggregate that up over the course of a couple of years, and that makes a big difference. And so the children of Latin American immigrants are just as likely to be socially mobile than the children of other immigrant backgrounds, but it's for different reasons.
Interesting. Do you think of this as some evidence that points toward the kind of declining role of cities in economic prosperity? Or does it kind of go the other way around, where, if they're less powerful accelerants, then they, yeah, I mean, I guess they're sort of the same type of thing. I mean, to the extent that they're less correlated, like, they would explain both the declining role of cities, but also the different, like, mechanisms for people to get ahead. So are these new mechanisms like more education, more time worked, are they kind of substitutes for moving to productive cities being a good way to get ahead?
First of all, now 80% of the country is urban. And so if we're going back 100
Hmm.
years, we're more at the point where it's 50-50 urban or even less. And so there's more of a scope to differentiate yourself. Just, do I live in a city or not? Now, essentially, everyone lives in a city. We're up to 80%. And so there's two possible explanations for what's going on. I don't know which one really carries the day. One is that cities aren't as different now as they used to be.
As different from each other or as
As
different
different
from
from each other. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So it used to be like, if you want to work in the motor vehicle industry, you go to Detroit.
Yeah.
And so cities were more specialized at the time. And now, given that 70% of the economy is working in services, and, in that healthcare and education are some of the biggest industries, like that's going to be present everywhere. And maybe there isn't as much scope to like, well, I know I'll get ahead by moving to this particular city where the opportunities are better. So that would be the hopeful story, is like cities have just homogenized. The country geographically has homogenized because now it's much more urban and there isn't the urban rural divide. And then within cities, they aren't as different from each other as they used to be. That's one possibility. The other possibility is like, no, they're still super productive cities like San Francisco, but we just can't afford to go to them, so that it's a matter of like maybe geography would matter more if immigrant families could afford to move to some of the most productive cities. My guess is it has a little bit more to do with the first story, but the second story is probably playing a role as well.
Yeah. One thing that I always find funny at the very end of Fiddler on the Roof. So, Fiddler on the Roof is like, this like small little nothing village, where everyone's like a tradesperson. And then at the very end, they're fleeing Russia, this little village of Anatevka. And then at the end, they say, where are you going to go? And some of them say, oh, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there. And one person says, oh, I have relatives in Cleveland, so I might go to Cleveland. And I every time I hear that, I'm like, whoa, like this just seems like such a page out of like the dark ages. And I'm like, wow, how could this little city exist in the same time period as the existence of Cleveland? And it just seems crazy that they could move to like a real city with like buildings and industry, and it just seems so striking to me. But I wonder, I mean, I know I'm throwing all these like decompositional questions at you, which are hard to answer. But I guess I wonder, in that story, you're going from a sending family that is from a very non-urbanized part of their country to an urbanized part of a destination country. And the fact that the US is more urbanized now than it used to be, I imagine probably corresponds with the sending countries also getting more urbanized. So I wonder if there's like a difference between like urban to urban versus rural to urban, and like whether that matters.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that specifically, but just to say, stepping back a little bit, if you think about the selection of who is moving from the sending country. Is it the richest? Is it the poorest? The Statue of Liberty says, send us, you're tired, you're poor. So the
Yeah.
idea in the Statue of Liberty is like, our immigrants are going to be from the poorer side of their home country. So if you look at how that's changed over time, 100 years ago, immigrants were around average for their sending country. They were just sort of the typical person. And if anything, the statue was right that they were a little bit poorer. Today, immigrants tend to be very positively selected from their home country. So they're more likely to be highly educated relative to others from the home country. They're more likely to have some family assets or some family wealth relative to others from the home country. And some countries, it's like really off the charts. So like Nigeria is a case where 60% of people who leave Nigeria to immigrate somewhere else in the world, could be the US, but also other destinations, 60% of them have a college degree compared to 5% of Nigeria as a whole. And those stats might be like 10 years out of date. I don't want to, don't take them to the bank, but
No,
that's the
that's
degree
not.
of positive selection that immigrants have. So you're probably right that immigrants today are more likely to come from urban areas within their home country, and they're going urban to urban. And historically, it was really a village sort of peasant population to an urban area, which was just a really dramatic difference. And Fiddler on the Roof illustrates that well, I think.
Yeah. So here's a selection story that I want to gauge your reaction to. You've made the case that the real economic growth from migrating really happens to the children of migrants, and the actual migrants themselves is like not that much of a story there. So do you think that the people that select into migrating are the ones who are sort of doing it more for their children? Like are they people that sort of care more about their legacy, their children? Like, are they more family oriented? oriented in a way? Do they even know that their children will have more success than they will? Or do they think that they're going to have success themselves? Do you think this is a motivator?
Well, I think this comes back to the very first question that you asked me, which is how much of the mobility is coming from just the move from the home country to the destination. And so you're right that we find once you arrive in the US, the immigrant parent, doesn't really move up that much relative to a similar US born worker. Someone who's 40 or 50 who's born in the US, and you compare them to someone who was born, in Mexico or in India. But a lot of the mobility happened just when you get off the boat, so to speak. Today it's probably get off the plane, but that is a powerful motivation to move where you might not be thinking about your kids. You may not have any kids. You may not even be married yet, right? And you're just thinking about yourself, and standard of living kind of immediately changes. But then this puts you as an immigrant sort of lower on the totem pole in the destination country. And so then the move up is pretty slow. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if people are thinking psychologically, are they thinking about that first step for themselves and maybe sending remittances home and being able to help support the family at home? Or are they also thinking sort of generationally and they're aware that there's going to be advantages for their kids? I mean, when you hear immigrants talk, they often say, well, I did it for you, talking to their kids. Like
Yeah.
I worked 2 jobs. Like I worked at a job that was lower than my training and my skill and saved up so that I could invest in you. So that gives you a sense that they are thinking about the kids as well.
Yeah, I mean that tracks with the story you were telling earlier about people just working more hours, about just like the quantity of work expanding. That seems more selfless on the margin. Okay, so there are all these like positive selection criterion, which it sounds like they're getting more positive. So how do you make sense of what seems to be like a very stark decline in sentiment toward immigrants, at least in the very current period? I know like the long-term trend might be different, but seems like there's some meaningful decline. How do you think about that?
You'll permit me to just mention the long run trend because that's a
Yeah, yeah.
large part of how I think about, so I'll talk about some long run and then also compare the US to other countries. So we've been looking at sentiment towards immigration by analyzing congressional speeches. Now, I mean, this is obviously elite political speech. It doesn't necessarily fully reflect what the electorate is thinking, but there is some association between the speeches and attitudes data, for
It
example.
seems like a good proxy to me. I mean, these speeches wouldn't be made, presumably, if their electorate didn't align with them.
Right, right. So on average, it's probably reflecting the electorate. And just to say that anti-immigrant sentiment historically, if you go back to late 19th, early 20th century, that was a bipartisan agreement. Like both parties and in every region of the country were on net anti-immigration. And eventually these politicians succeed in closing the border in the 1920s. They tried multiple times before and their border closure legislation was vetoed by the president. So there was just like pervasive anti-immigrant sentiment historically. And what's different today is that we now have a lot of polarization and we have one party that's very pro-immigration. The Democratic Party is just very pro-immigration in the speeches, and the Republican Party is trending negative, trending away from positive speech about immigration. So that's the US case. And then what we've been looking at recently is comparing US political speech about immigration to other receiving countries. We looked at the UK and we looked at 7 continental European countries. And here's a really startling fact that comes out of this new paper. The Democrats are the most positive party in our sample
Oh,
out of,
wow.
let's say, 100 parties on
In the
immigration
world.
in the world. Now, I mean, we don't
Yeah.
have the whole world, but like, in
Yeah.
this set of 9 advanced economies, which represent around 2/3 of immigration to rich countries, the Democrats are the most positive. And this
Huh.
really surprised me because I thought, well, in a European parliamentary system, you would think there would be like one small party, right?
Right. There's so much more variety.
Right, so much more
That's
variety. But
wild.
the Democrats are just very, very positive. And the Republicans look sort of like the center right
Wait, do you
in
mind if I
Europe.
ask what time period this is? Like, is this like in the last 3 years, or is this in the last like 20 years or something?
The last 25 years.
Okay.
But then we split it. So 2015 is the year that we take to split the data
Okay.
because 2015 is when Trump starts campaigning in the US. And also it's the
Mhm.
Syrian refugee crisis in Germany and in the rest of Europe. So
Right, right, right.
but in both locations, it seems like 2015 is potentially a meaningful split. And essentially, all of the center right parties start shifting more anti immigration after 2015. Republicans, too, European center right parties as well. But the average Republican does not look like the far right in Europe. It looks like the center right. And then Trump himself looks closer to the far right. Not all the way, but so essentially the question is like, is Trump this bellwether of, things are going to move in his direction? Well, I don't know, because that's not what the average Republican looks like. And so he's sort of going out on a limb that's beyond where the rest of his party is. And I think that makes sense. I mean, that's what we see from the data. But then if you think about like the rhetoric that we hear, there is a very like strident leading anti-immigrant movement, but it's not obvious that everyone is sort of following along with that. Forget about the Democrats, who are still quite positive. Even within the Republican base, you're not necessarily seeing everyone falling in line.
Yeah, that's such an interesting finding. I guess I'm wondering, like, if that really does translate to policy, both like cross-sectionally and over time. Like is sentiment a good predictor of policy, or just like kind of unrelated?
I would say that among various domains of policy, immigration policy is relatively divorced from sentiment because the executive branch has so much control over
In the
immigration.
US or
In
in
the
this other
US.
sample? Okay.
Yeah. So, and I'm not sure about other countries, but immigration is under the purview of foreign policy to some extent, right? It has to do with our borders. And so because it has to do with the borders, then it's more under the purview of the executive than other domains would be. And so that gives rise to what's been happening over the past 15 years, at least, is that we windshield wiper back and forth between if there's a Democrat in office, if there's a Republican in office. All of a sudden, all these programs, temporary protected service, TPS, DACA, refugee programs, like these can all just get closed or they can get opened by the president. And that can be relatively divorced from sentiment. Notice that Trump has not proposed any legislation really on immigration. It's not like he is
Well, there was
saying,
the closest I think was like the H-1B visa fee, but that didn't turn out to be as powerful of a policy as I think he wanted. But that seemed like a big deal when it was announced.
and I believe H-1B visa fees can just be, I believe they can be added, and this I don't know. So I believe that kind of policy can be added without congressional action.
Right.
So there's not as much need for congressional action in this domain, and therefore there can be like a small vanguard that ends up changing policy in both directions, because there's
Yeah.
also elements to what the Democrats say that are sort of more on one edge relative to where the electorate would be. And so there's a lot of oscillation that can happen with immigration policy. And I don't really see that changing because, the last time that we tried for some kind of bipartisan immigration reform, the idea of comprehensive immigration reform, there was the Gang of Eight, there was 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats in the Senate, and, it did pass the Senate, did not pass the House. That was 2013. And there really hasn't been that kind of effort since then. And the idea was always like, okay, well, we're going to sweeten the deal, right? So we're going to have a legalization program for children who arrived without documents, also for parents. So we're going to have like a pretty large amnesty, but we're going to sweeten the deal for the Republicans by also putting in border control and, e-verify and that sort of thing. So it's going to be like, we're tough on the border, but we're nice for the immigrants who are already here. And there was many attempts at this and it did not succeed. So I haven't really seen much push for legislation, in years.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so I have one final question for you, and it's about a population that you know very well. What do you think the sentiment toward immigration is among economists, and how has that changed?
That's very interesting. So I went to 2 conferences, which were combining economists with philosophers to talk about immigration policy. And I was so surprised when I was there to realize that economists in general have like a pretty individual oriented view of immigration policy. And they're very focused on the first question you asked me, which is, are there $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk? Are there people who are born into a location that's not very productive for them, but they themselves are like a very highly able and skilled person? And should that person be restrained in being able to search out a location where they could increase their marginal product? That is the way economists tend to think about immigration, is from an individual perspective, right? Philosophers do not think about it that way.
Really?
Now, there's a range. There are some open borders and libertarian style philosophers, but what I noticed, and if there's a philosopher who hears this who objects, maybe I only went to two conferences, so I'm not saying this is the full discipline, was there was much more focus on the community of receiving the destination country as a group of citizens, as a collective and a community that does have the right to restrict entry into their community. And what does that mean then in terms of balancing maybe is it a right of an individual to move from their place of birth? But if they're moving from their place of birth, they're entering another location and that's impinging on others. And then how do you navigate that? I was blown away because economists just don't really think about it that way. But now that we're in this new world where there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment and there's backlash and there's far-right politics, especially in Europe, rising, I think there's now growing awareness. And maybe you would think of it as coming more from like political economy, that there's going to be this tension and that tension is something that we need to understand.
That's so surprising to me because I think when economists make the case for more immigration, I feel like it's very often done on philosophical grounds. They have this like veil of ignorance, and there's also this concept of if you're kind of stopping two parties from transacting, you're sort of responsible for that lack of transaction. Like, if thirsty person wants to buy water and someone else wants to drink that water, then and you're standing there with a gun, not letting them transact, and the person dies of thirst, you're sort of responsible. Like that is a philosophical argument.
100%. But what I realized was that there's actually two traditions within philosophy. And again, I'm sure I'm flattening it out. There's probably way more than two, but there's two. That is one view. And that is philosophically grounded. But there's this another view that the person with the gun, is there as a representative of their community, and their community has the right to organize society the way that they, as a democratic collective, decide to do. And that might include including others, and it might not include including others.
Yeah. Well, I love the idea that economists and philosophers are meeting and talking about this stuff. And I'm, excited that you're there representing this side of the aisle. This was so fun chatting. For any listeners, check out Leah Boustan's writing, articles, upcoming articles, book, all that stuff.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also, I want to plug your Twitter presence.
Well, I have to say I'm not really very socially media active anymore. The whole social media world has fragmented, but I really enjoyed getting to know people back in the day, in the golden age.
Yeah, I also have a very hard time being on Twitter right now. I kind of left it, but just get the leftovers that show up on Substack. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was really fun.
The Economics of Work is brought to you by Revelio Labs, workforce data for research and benchmarking. If you enjoyed, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It'll help us reach other curious listeners. I'm your host, Ben Zweig. Our producer is Cole Wagner. Thanks for listening.